My name is Madison. I'm 30, and on the night of my sister's wedding, I sat in a room full of people who shared my blood but treated me like a stranger. To them, I was never a daughter, never a sister, never a guest. I was the dog walker, the family's convenient shadow, the easy punchline that kept their glasses raised higher. Have you ever felt invisible at the very table where love was supposed to live? I thought I knew my role by heart, the silence, the smirks, the laughter at my expense. But life has a way of turning cruelty into confession, and the very word they used to shame me became the reason they could no longer look away. Because behind their mockery stood Hollywood's $200 producer. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as the winding road curved between the rows of Napa Valley vineyards. The late afternoon sun spilled a honey-colored glow over the hills, and strings of fairy lights already flickered in the distance where the Harris estate loomed. It had been years since I'd driven this way, years since I'd allowed myself to step back into the orbit of my family. Yet here I was, wearing a dress that felt more like armor than celebration, heading straight into my sister's wedding. I pulled into the long gravel driveway, my tires crunching over the stones. The estate looked like something out of a magazine. Arched trellis covered in white roses, a massive oak tree wrapped with ribbons, and a wide tent set up in the vineyard's clearing. Guests in sharp tuxedos and jewel-toned gowns clustered near the champagne bar, laughing with ease. I recognized none of them, but I didn't need to. The air already told me what role I'd be playing, the one who didn't belong. I parked at the far end, the place the staff usually used, and sat for a moment in silence. Through the windshield I could see Emily in her silk gown, blonde hair swept into a perfect chignon, smiling at the photographer as if she had trained her whole life for this spotlight. She was 27, and in my parents' eyes, the definition of perfection. I whispered under my breath, almost like an admission to the car itself, I've always been the shadow. When I finally stepped out, the scent of lavender mixed with wine carried on the breeze. I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders and walked toward the entrance. The moment I crossed under the floral arch, I was swallowed by noise, voices booming, champagne glasses clinking. The string quartet, swelling with a cheerful melody. It was dazzling, but not for me. Madison. My mother's voice cut across the chatter like a blade. Margaret stood just inside the foyer of the estate house, emerald green dress hugging her frame, a pearl necklace at her throat. She didn't smile, didn't open her arms for an embrace. She only pressed a silver tray into my hands. Take these gifts into the main hall, will you, and help line them on the table by the guest book. I blinked, the weight of the tray pressing into my palms. Hi to you too, Mom, I murmured, but she had already turned away, greeting one of Emily's bridesmaids with effusive warmth. I shifted the tray against my hip and made my way inside. The interior gleamed like a spread from Architectural Digest. Chandeliers dripped crystals overhead. Tables draped in ivory linens glistened with polished silver, and waiters in white jackets floated past with trays of hors d'oeuvres. I felt like I had walked into a theater production where everyone else knew their lines and I had been cast as background scenery. "Is that Madison?" one of my aunts whispered from near the bar. I caught Aunt Linda's reflection in a gilt mirror leaning toward Aunt Carol. At least she showed up. Maybe she'll keep busy tonight carrying things around. She's always been good at that. They laughed softly, sipping their wine. I pretended not to hear, setting the gifts on the display table beside the guest book. My fingers lingered on the bows, straightening ribbons that didn't need straightening, giving my hands a task to anchor the shaking that threatened to betray me. Across the room, Emily twirled slowly as the photographer adjusted his lens. "You're perfect," he told her, and she beamed. My father. Charles stood beside her, glass of bourbon in hand, pride radiating from him like a spotlight. "My daughter," he told a cluster of guests. "The most beautiful bride Napa has ever seen." Laughter followed, warm and affirming. No one noticed me in the corner with my back to the wall. I carried another small box someone had thrust into my hands to the table, weaving between guests as though I were one of the servers. The irony wasn't lost on me. My shoes clicked softly against the marble floor, drowned out by the chorus of compliments showering over Emily. I forced my lips into something that looked like a smile but felt more like a shield. My chest ached with a familiar heaviness, the kind that comes from being present but invisible. From across the hall, my mother called out again, her tone sharp, though her face remained smiling for her companions. "Madison, after you finish with those, make sure the place cards are aligned." The caterer's staff missed a few. Her instructions carried the ease of someone who had always expected me to play the role of helper, not guest. I nodded, though she didn't look my way. Balancing the last box, I caught sight of Emily hugging Mark's parents, Eleanor and Edward Harris. They looked every bit the wealthy Napa couple, polished and confident, their words laced with admiration for Emily's charm. Edward clasped my father on the back. "You must be so proud," he said. My father's laugh echoed through the hall. "She's everything we dreamed of." I shifted the gift into place, straightened it unnecessarily, and stood back. My reflection caught in the mirror behind the table. Dark dress, simple makeup, hair tied back. I blended in so well I could have been part of the decor. I thought of how different it might feel if even once someone looked at me with that same pride. For a fleeting moment, Emily's gaze flicked toward me. Her lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. It was the kind of glance that said, "Stay in your lane." She turned back instantly to Mark, who kissed her temple, both of them glowing in their shared spotlight. I lowered my eyes, lifted another empty tray from a side table, and moved it to the kitchen. The staff nodded politely at me, not realizing I wasn't one of them. For a second, I almost laughed at the absurdity. Here I was, the sister of the bride, blending seamlessly with the catering crew. As I walked back into the hall, the noise hit me again. Cheers, clinking glasses, camera shutters snapping. I placed the tray down, adjusted the tablecloth on instinct, and let my eyes drift over the crowd. Everyone seemed so at ease, so sure of their place in this tableau. Everyone but me. I drew a breath, steady and deliberate, telling myself to hold it together. Tonight wasn't about me, I reminded myself. It never was. And as I watched Emily sparkle in the glow of her perfect moment, I knew my role hadn't changed. Not yet. I remember the smell of wet pavement and dog hair clinging to my clothes more vividly than anything I learned in class that year. In 2012, I was 20, a student at USC's film school by day, and a dog walker by night, trudging through Los Angeles neighborhoods with leashes tangled around my wrists. I told myself it was temporary, a way to pay rent and scrape by, until I could prove I belonged in the world I dreamed about. But my family never let me forget it. Dog walking degree. My father had said the first time he found out. He laughed like it was clever, repeating it at the dinner table so many times it became a chorus. My mother smirked and shook her head. "At least it keeps you out of trouble." And Emily, only 19 then, loved the line so much. She carried it with her like a family heirloom, retelling it to anyone who'd listen. I'd come home one weekend covered in mud, still in sneakers from an evening of walking 6 Labradors, who had dragged me across Echo Park, and Emily had brought a group of her college friends over. "This is my sister," she'd said brightly, waving her manicured hand at me. "She studies film but spends her nights picking up dog poop." Her friends had burst out laughing. My face burned, but I said nothing, gripping the straps of my backpack as if they might hold me together. Even back then, I learned the power of silence. Words from me only fed them, gave them more ammunition. So I swallowed it all and pushed forward, telling myself one day it wouldn't matter. One day they'd choke on their own laughter. The years passed, but the sting stayed. Their words clung to me like burrs I couldn't shake. And standing there in the back hall of the estate years later, I realized nothing had changed. I had slipped behind the main reception tent to escape the noise, a glass of champagne balanced carefully in my hand. I thought I might get a moment to breathe, to collect myself before re-entering the theater of my sister's perfect day. But then I heard Emily's voice carrying through the open door. She was surrounded by her bridesmaids, all in blush satin, their curls pinned tight, their eyes wide as they soaked up every word she gave them. Emily had always been magnetic in moments like this. "You know my sister," she said with a grin, and I could hear the delight in her tone even before the punchline came. "She once thought she'd be the next Spielberg. But do you know what she really did in college? She walked dogs every night, picking up poop in alleyways while pretending she was a filmmaker." The group erupted in laughter. Champagne flutes, clinking, one of the girls squealing, "No way!" Emily leaned in closer, lowering her voice like she was letting them in on a delicious secret. "That's our Madison. Always chasing dreams, always ending up in the dirt." The laughter spilled into the hall, wrapping around me like smoke. My hand trembled, champagne rippling dangerously close to the rim. I pressed my fingers tighter around the stem, forcing my knuckles white, determined not to let it spill, not to let it show. I should have walked away, but I stood there, rooted to the floor, caught between anger and the familiar numbness of resignation. Their laughter sounded exactly like it had 10 years earlier, echoing across dinner tables and dorm rooms, bouncing off the walls of every place I had ever called home. One of the bridesmaids piped up, "Well, at least she loves animals." The group laughed harder. Emily's voice rose above them, smooth and certain. "She loves being invisible. That's what she loves." Something inside me twisted sharp and deep. I lifted the glass to my lips, but the champagne tasted bitter metallic, as though it had absorbed the venom of their words. I swallowed anyway, forcing my smile into place when one of the caterers passed me in the hall. To him, I must have looked like any other guest pausing for a drink. He couldn't see the storm behind my eyes. I adjusted my grip on the glass and inhaled slowly through my nose. My reflection glimmered faintly in the window pane beside me. Dark dress shoulders, squared chin held just high enough to keep from crumbling. I had learned to wear that mask well. Inside, Emily's laughter rang out again, brighter, sharper, punctuated by her bridesmaids' squeals. I forced myself to turn to step away from the door and back toward the main hall, each heel strike against the hardwood floor, a reminder to keep moving. The music swelled again, the chatter of hundreds of guests rising, as if nothing cruel had just been said in the side room. I slipped back into the flow, weaving between tables, my glass still trembling faintly in my hand. No one noticed. No one ever did. And as I took my seat at the far end of the hall, I kept the smile fixed, the mask intact, while inside the old wounds bled fresh, reminding me that some scars never fade, no matter how many years pass. The doors to the reception tent opened wide, and the hum of conversation shifted into applause as the string quartet struck up a lively tune. Waiters glided through the aisles carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres, tiny crab cakes, truffle risotto bites, seared scallops gleaming under soft lights. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and champagne, a mix that clung to the heavy fabric of the tent. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The MC's voice boomed from the stage, polished and theatrical. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our radiant bride and her dashing groom, Emily and Mark Harris." The spotlight followed them as they entered, Emily in her silk gown, sequins catching every flicker of light like shards of glass. Mark looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine tuxedo, tailored perfectly, hand resting on hers with the ease of possession. The crowd rose to its feet, cheering, glasses, raised cameras flashing like fireworks. I stayed seated at my corner table near the back, clapping politely, my hands barely touching. From where I sat, I could see the swirl of bodies pressing in around them, guests leaning close to offer kisses on the cheek, blessings, jokes. Emily's laugh rang clear, practiced, but convincing. "The most beautiful bride Napa has ever seen," someone declared, and the chorus of agreement followed instantly. I let my eyes drift down to the linen tablecloth, tracing the embroidered vines with a fingertip. My glass of champagne stood untouched beside me, the bubbles rising and fading, a show put on for no one. Across the table, Aunt Linda's shrill voice carried over the music. "Well, at least Madison has her talents." She leaned toward Aunt Carol, who pursed her lips into a smile. "She's always been good with animals. Some people are just meant for simple work." Carol gave a mock sigh. Yes, not everyone can shine under a spotlight, but someone has to walk the dogs. They both chuckled, sipping their wine. I didn't flinch. I'd grown used to hearing variations of the same line my whole life. Still, it landed like grit between my teeth, impossible to swallow. The photographer urged Emily and Mark toward the dance floor for their first spin, and everyone crowded closer, forming a circle around them. I remained in my seat, the music washing over me. Their bodies moved gracefully, rehearsed the picture of perfection. Guests murmured comparisons to Hollywood romances, comments about how lucky Emily was, how she had made it. A group of Emily's friends hovered near the stage, phones in hand. They snapped photo after photo, their laughter bubbling high and careless. One of them glanced toward me, smirked, and shifted her angle. The flash burst again. I looked up just in time to see the image on her screen. Emily and Mark glowed in the center, flawless, joyful. And in the far left corner, blurred by shadow there, I was standing stiffly by my chair. She tapped her screen quickly, typing something under the picture. The others burst out laughing. Curiosity tugged at me despite myself. As I stood to refill my glass of water, I passed near enough to catch a glimpse. The caption under Emily's photo read, "The Help." A laugh too sharp cut through their little circle. One of them raised her glass. At least the family brought extra staff tonight. I paused, glass in hand, then forced myself to keep walking. My throat tightened, but I took a long sip of water anyway, letting the chill burn down my chest. I set the glass back on the table, adjusting my napkin like it was the only thing anchoring me to the floor. The music swelled louder as Emily twirled in Mark's arms, the crowd clapping in rhythm. I studied them from the distance. She looked every bit the fairy tale bride she'd always imagined, and I once again was cast in the role they had written for me, invisible, mocked, just out of frame. I placed the napkin neatly across my lap, my hands steady, though the sting still pulsed inside me, and let the scene unfold, a show I'd been watching my entire life. The clinking of silverware and the hum of voices swirled around me as waiters set down plates of seared halibut and roasted vegetables. I had just taken a sip of water when I heard my cousin Daniel's voice rise above the music, sharp and playful, the kind of tone he used when he wanted an audience. "Hey, remember when Madison ended up in court over that dog?" he said, laughing as if it were the funniest thing in the world. A few heads turned in my direction, forks pausing midair. Emily leaned in toward her bridesmaids, her voice pitched loud enough to carry, "Oh my God, yes. My sister, the aspiring filmmaker making headlines because she got sued for animal neglect." She grinned as if the memory were a gift she could unwrap again and again. She didn't even make the news for her work. She made it for a dog. The table erupted in laughter. Even some of the guests who didn't know the story laughed because the energy made them think they should. I lowered my eyes to my plate, tracing the rim with my fingertip. Inside, though, the laughter snapped me back 7 years. It had been 2016, one of the hardest years of my life. I was 23, broke, juggling odd jobs while still chasing the scraps of my film school dreams. A client had accused me of leaving their terrier tied up in the sun too long, claiming I had endangered the dog's life. The allegation spiraled quickly, dragging me into court. My family's reaction was swift and merciless. My father shook his head at the dinner table. Not famous in Hollywood, but infamous in court. "That's our Madison." My mother sighed as though it were inevitable. "Maybe this will teach you to stop chasing nonsense." And Emily paraded the story like it was her crown jewel. I once overheard her telling her sorority friends, "My sister's claim to fame, a lawsuit about dog poop." I can still feel the sting of those words, the way my chest tightened as I sat in the back of that courtroom. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the judge's bench towering above me. The plaintiff sat smugly across the aisle, whispering to their lawyer while I clutched the edges of my chair and tried to look calm. But I wasn't wrong. I had proof, time logs, witness statements from neighbors. The truth was on my side. And when the judge finally spoke, her gavel striking the wood, the sound reverberated through my bones. "Case dismissed," she said firmly. "The defendant is cleared of all charges." Relief had poured through me so fast my knees went weak, and then came the second blow. financial but in my favor. The judge ordered the plaintiff to pay me damages for defamation and legal costs. $50,000. $50,000. To my family it was pocket change compared to Emily's picture-perfect path, but to me it was a lifeline. With that money, I produced my first short film. It wasn't much, shot in cramped apartments with borrowed equipment, but it was mine. And that little film went on to win a student award at a regional festival, a tiny spark that would ignite everything else. I never told my family. They never asked. They only remembered the humiliation, never the victory. Poor dogs. Aunt Carol sighed dramatically at the wedding table, shaking her head as if the memory still shamed her. A few guests glanced my way, their eyes filled with the easy judgment of people who had never questioned the story they were told. I pressed my napkin to my lap, my teeth sinking into my lower lip, until the sting brought me back into the present. I wanted to stand to tell them the truth, to remind them that the lawsuit had been a lie, and that the money from it had started my career. But I stayed silent because I knew the truth would mean nothing to them now. Emily lifted her glass, smirking toward me. Not exactly the Sundance debut she dreamed of, right? The bridesmaids tittered. Someone clinked a fork against their glass, urging the music back up. The moment faded into the noise, but my chest still burned. I inhaled slowly, remembering that gavel, the judge's steady voice, the check in my trembling hands. That day hadn't been my ruin. It had been my rebirth. And though they couldn't see it, I knew every cruel laugh at this table was one more brick laid in the foundation of the person I had become. I set my glass down carefully, folding my hands in my lap to hide the tension in my fingers, and forced my face into its usual calm. The laughter carried on around me, loud and oblivious. But inside I held tight to the memory of winning, of standing up in that courtroom and walking out free. That was the part they never knew. And that was the part that mattered. Margaret stood at the center of the reception hall, her emerald dress shimmering under the chandeliers, as if she were the one being celebrated. She raised her glass high, her voice ringing clear above the music. Our Emily has found such a successful man. We couldn't be more proud. The crowd cheered, clinking glasses, a ripple of admiration spreading through the tables. My father, Charles, leaned toward Edward Harris, Mark's father, and the two men laughed loudly, their bourbon glasses colliding. "We are lucky men." Charles declared, his chest puffed with pride. Edward nodded in agreement, grinning as if the families had struck gold with this marriage. I sat at my table near the back, clapping politely, the sound of my own hands hollow in my ears. My voiceover threaded through the noise in my mind. In their eyes, I didn't exist. My presence was a formality, nothing to celebrate, nothing to acknowledge. I sipped from my water glass, letting the chill press against the heat in my chest, and tried to fix my gaze anywhere but the spotlight bathing my sister. Her laughter soared above the hum of the crowd, every word she spoke rewarded with smiles, nods, applause. She soaked in the adoration like sunlight. It was then I noticed Jake, my 23-year-old cousin, slouched casually near the bar, phone in hand. He angled the camera toward me, smirking as his thumb darted across the screen. A second later, a muffled snicker broke out from the group clustered around him. I shifted in my chair, uneasy, my instincts telling me I'd just become their latest punchline. From across the room, I caught the glow of Jake's phone screen. My face was there, caught mid-blink, sitting alone at the edge of the celebration. And beneath it, in bold letters, he had typed, "Forever Dog Walker." He passed the phone to the girl next to him, who burst out laughing. She covered her mouth too late, the sound already spilling into the air. The phone made its way down the line, each set of eyes lighting up with amusement, each laugh louder than the last. I felt the heat climb my neck up to my ears, my pulse hammering against my skin. They were laughing at me in real time, passing me around like some party trick, a joke to be enjoyed alongside the champagne. I forced my hands to remain still on the table, my smile carefully composed, though inside my chest ached. I had been the family's punchline for so long. But there was something crueler about seeing it captured, captioned, circulated. One of the younger guests leaned over, whispering just loud enough for me to catch, "She really does look like Staff." The group erupted again, trying and failing to stifle themselves. I glanced toward Emily. She was oblivious, spinning under the lights with Mark, her gown glinting like she'd stepped straight out of a bridal magazine. My parents were close behind her, fielding congratulations, talking about honeymoons and future grandchildren, their faces flushed with wine and pride. Not one of them looked at me. Not one of them saw the way I sat frozen at the table while my cousin broadcasted my humiliation. I turned slightly, catching a clearer glimpse of Jake's phone as it lit up again. He was adding a filter this time. Sparkles framing my face, the caption flashing in neon, "The Help." The girl beside him snorted, nearly choking on her champagne. "Send it to me," she whispered, elbowing him. His grin widened. I drew a slow breath, forcing the air down into my lungs as if I could steady myself that way. My eyes stung, but I refused to let them see. I refused to give them the satisfaction of watching me flinch. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass until the chill of the water seeped into my skin. I looked down at my lap, folded the napkin neatly, once, twice, just to have something to do with my hands. The laughter around Jake's group quieted, eventually swallowed again by the roar of applause as Emily and Mark ended their dance, with a dip her gown pooling elegantly across the floor. Everyone surged forward to congratulate them, their cheers filling the space like a wave crashing over me. I straightened in my chair, schooling my features into calm, even as my stomach twisted. I had been mocked before hundreds of times, but tonight the cruelty carried a sharper edge. It wasn't just whispered jokes or sly comments. Tonight it was captured, saved, ready to be replayed again and again. I forced myself to meet Jake's eyes across the room. He held my gaze for a second, his smirk daring me to react, to rise to give him more material. I didn't move. I let the silence between us stretch my face blank, my eyes steady. So, his grin faltered for a moment before he looked away, shoving the phone back into his pocket. The ache in my chest lingered, but I sat there, unmoving, unwilling to break. Their laughter still echoed in my ears, but I kept my mask intact. In a room that had decided I was invisible, my only weapon was to act like I didn't hear a thing. Mark's eyes found me, more than once, quick glances across the tables when he thought no one else was watching. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. People scan the room all the time at weddings. But then it happened again, his gaze settling on me for a beat too long before he turned back to smile at Emily. I kept my posture steady, my hands folded neatly in my lap, though the back of my neck prickled under his attention. I had felt this kind of stare before, not hostile but questioning, as though he was trying to fit me into a picture he couldn't quite recognize. At the next table, Eleanor's voice rose above the music, polished and confident, carrying easily across the hall. "Emily is truly remarkable," she told my parents, her smile wide enough for everyone nearby to see. "She knows how to carry herself. Graceful, intelligent. Exactly the kind of partner Mark deserves." Edward chimed in, his tone firm as though delivering a closing argument in court. "We've always wanted a daughter-in-law who could keep up with the demands of Mark's career. Emily fits that role perfectly. A natural match." My mother leaned forward eagerly, nodding her pearls, catching the light. "She's always been destined for something special," she said. My father raised his glass to Edward with a laugh. "Couldn't have asked for a better union." Their voices circled the table like polished ornaments, each word hanging there to reinforce the story being built. Emily, the ideal bride, the perfect choice. I sat just a few feet away, close enough to hear every syllable, yet I might as well have been invisible. Not one of them included me in the conversation. Not one glance in my direction. I let my eyes drift toward the dance floor where Emily stood, surrounded by her bridesmaids, the silk of her gown catching every flicker of the chandelier. Her laugh rang out bright and sharp, slicing through the music. She leaned against Mark's arm, whispering something into his ear before turning to the crowd with a dazzling smile. Then, out of nowhere, her voice carried above the chatter. "My sister," she said with a flourish, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "Always the dog walker of the family." The words landed like a stone dropped in water ripples spreading through the room. A few nearby guests chuckled, polite but sharp enough to sting. I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't move. I lifted my glass of water instead, the cool surface grounding me as I took a deliberate sip. My eyes flicked toward Mark, just for a moment. And there it was. The shift. His smile faltered. His posture stiffened almost imperceptibly, but enough for me to notice. The corners of his mouth twitched, as if he wanted to say something but didn't. His eyes darted toward me, then back to Emily, the calculation behind them plain as day. He knew something. Or maybe he had heard my name somewhere before in a context that didn't match Emily's story. Whatever it was, the word dog walker clearly didn't sit right with him. I set my glass back down carefully, folding my napkin flat on the table. Outwardly, I remained calm, just another guest at just another wedding. But inside, I felt the first stirrings of change. For the first time that night, I wasn't the only one unsettled by Emily's joke. And Mark's hesitation, however small, was enough to tell me the cracks had already begun to form. I can still feel the weight of that night in 2018, the trembling in my hands as I stepped onto the small stage in Park City. The indie film I had poured everything into. Every dollar, every sleepless night, every ounce of stubborn faith had just won a jury award at Sundance. The crowd rose to their feet, applause crashing like a wave that nearly swept me off the stage. For a moment, I let it wash over me, soaking in the sound I'd been starving for my whole life recognition. The lights blinded me as I took the glass plaque, my smile faltering only when I thought about telling my family. I had imagined calling my mom, hearing the pride in her voice, maybe even seeing my father choke back emotion. But then another memory intruded. Emily's smirk the last time I'd mentioned a film project, the way she'd tilted her head and asked, "So, is anyone going to actually watch it?" I remembered my father chuckling. "Hobbies are nice, but real life comes first." I swallowed the urge to share, pressing the plaque against my chest backstage, whispering to myself, "This is mine, even if they never know." That moment should have been a turning point. It was in many ways, but it was also a secret victory, one I held alone because I couldn't bear to see it dismissed with the same casual cruelty they had shown me all my life. The sound of clinking glasses snapped me back into the present, the wedding tent glowing with golden light. The memory faded, but the ache of it lingered, curling tight in my stomach as I sat there. Emily's laugh cut through the music. She stood at the head table, arm draped around Mark, the picture of perfection. "My sister," she announced, her voice carrying just enough to draw the nearby tables. Always chasing some little project, but hey, at least she's reliable with pets. The bridesmaids giggled, leaning into one another like they were back in a dorm room sharing gossip. I clenched my jaw, but then I noticed movement across the room. Josh, my 18-year-old cousin, sat slouched in his chair with his phone angled slyly in front of him. The faint blue glow lit his face as he whispered something to the friend beside him. Both of them snickered. Curiosity pulled my eyes toward the screen. I caught just enough to recognize my own profile in the frame. Emily's voice, layered on top, always the dog walker. Josh was live streaming it. A bubble of humiliation rose in my throat, hot and suffocating. He wasn't just mocking me in the privacy of family anymore. He was broadcasting it, sending it out into a digital world that never forgets. The boy next to him laughed out loud, earning a sharp glance from his mother, but he waved her off. "It's just for fun," he muttered, grinning as the comments scrolled across the screen. "Poor maid of honor's sister," one wrote. "Sad, but kinda funny," another chimed in. And then, "Tough luck for the bride's family." Yikes. I forced my breathing steady, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles turned pale. I didn't need to read more. I could feel the sting of strangers' words even without seeing them, the way mockery multiplies when it's shared. Josh turned the phone slightly, and I knew he wanted me to notice. His grin widened when our eyes met, daring me to react. I didn't. I picked up my glass, brought it to my lips, and drank slowly, willing my face into calm. But inside my stomach churned. My skin felt hot, prickled with the knowledge that my image was already leaving this tent, carrying my humiliation with it. The live stream wasn't big yet. Only a handful of viewers, mostly kids, mostly harmless. But I knew how fast these things could spread. One careless post, one cruel joke, and suddenly the world is watching. I placed the glass back on the table and smoothed the napkin across my lap, my fingers trembling only slightly. The chatter rose again, attention shifting back to Emily as she basked in another wave of compliments. They hadn't noticed what was happening just a few tables away. Not yet. And I sat there in silence, a tight coil wound deep in my chest, knowing this was only the beginning. Emily stood, her silk gown catching the light as if even the chandeliers had been instructed to favor her. She raised her glass high, her cheeks flushed with wine and triumph. To my sister, she said, her smile stretching wide. The hall grew quiet, expectant, ready for another polished toast. Then her voice sharpened. Always the dog walker of this family, some things never change. The words cracked like a whip, and the laughter came instantly, a burst that rolled across the tables and up toward the rafters. Guests leaned back, glasses clinking, the sound swelling until it filled every corner of the tent. Even the band faltered, the violinist lowering her bow for half a beat before resuming as if the cruelty needed its own pause in the score. I felt it land sharp and familiar, a blow I'd been absorbing my entire life. I lifted my glass of water, the bubbles from the champagne on other tables sparkling around me like stars in someone else's sky. Inside, my voice whispered, steady but cold, "They need me small so she can shine. That has always been the bargain." The laughter stretched longer than it should have, long enough for my stomach to knot, long enough for my skin to prickle with heat. I sat perfectly still. The smile on my lips practiced the muscles in my jaw, aching from restraint. Across the room, Mark's laugh never came. His hand gripped the back of his chair, his eyes unfocused for a second. Then one of his colleagues leaned toward him, phone tilted discreetly. I saw the glow catch his face the way his eyes flickered down out of instinct. On the screen was an image I knew well. The bold blue banner, the crisp typography, my own face staring back with quiet defiance. Variety magazine, the headline stretched across the top, Madison Clark. Hollywood's rising producer helms 200 bundler Paramount project. I watched the blood drain from Mark's face, his smirk dissolving into something taut, uncertain. His colleague muttered something under his breath, tilting the phone closer. Mark's hand twitched, tightening against the chair as he took in the cover. His eyes snapped back toward me, and this time he didn't look away. For the first time all evening, his stare wasn't casual or curious. It was sharp, almost startled, as if he were suddenly piecing together a puzzle he hadn't known was sitting in front of him. Emily, still basking in the glow of her joke, leaned against his shoulder. "You know, Mark, she's always been reliable," she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Reliable and invisible. Every family needs one, right?" But he wasn't listening. His body stiffened, his smile wooden. He nodded automatically at the chorus of laughter still spilling from their friends, but his gaze kept sliding back toward me. I let my eyes meet his just long enough to register the shift. The disbelief, the recognition, the faint edge of awe he couldn't mask quickly enough. The sound of clinking glasses filled the air again as guests raised their drinks, still chuckling at Emily's jab. My father threw his head back, his booming laugh rattling the silverware. My mother dabbed the corner of her eye as though the toast had been affectionate instead of cruel, but Mark sat frozen, his glass untouched. His posture caught between the performance expected of him and the truth his eyes had just stumbled into. For years, they had laughed without consequence, their words vanishing into the air like smoke. But tonight, in that single glance, I felt the shift. His silence told me more than their laughter ever had. Mark pushed his chair back with a scrape that cut through the noise like a blade. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, but his voice carried steady enough to hush the nearest tables. "Is this you?" he asked. Eyes locked on me. "Madison Clark." The laughter still hanging in the air collapsed into silence. Forks froze mid-bite. A ripple of heads turned in my direction as if the question itself was absurd a mistake that would be corrected with a laugh and a shrug. Eleanor's pearl-clad hand tightened around her wine glass, her lips parting slightly. Edward leaned forward, brow furrowed his lawyer's gaze, measuring every detail. Emily forced a smile, her voice pitched too high. "Oh, come on. It's just a name. There must be dozens of Madisons in Los Angeles. Don't be ridiculous." She waved her hand toward me like she was brushing away a stray crumb. "She's not—" I let the moment hang, the quiet pressing in, heavy and suffocating. Then I nodded once, slow and deliberate, meeting Mark's eyes, without flinching. "Yes," I said softly, though my voice carried more than I expected. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Whispers buzzed immediately, sliding down the rows of tables like sparks catching dry grass. Mark's throat worked as he swallowed his gaze, flicking between the phone in his colleague's hand and my face. "I know this project," he said louder now, his tone firm enough to demand attention. "Paramount's new slate. I auditioned for it last spring. He pointed toward me almost in disbelief. "She's the producer. She's the one running it." Chairs shifted. Conversations broke out in low, frantic murmurs. A bridesmaid clutched Emily's arm, whispering something urgently. One of my younger cousins pulled out his phone, scrolling furiously, his eyes darting between the glowing screen and me. My father's laugh, which had roared so easily minutes ago, caught in his throat. He sat back hard in his chair, color draining from his cheeks. My mother's lips trembled as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Emily's face tightened, her smile slipping like a mask that no longer fit. That can't." She looked to Mark, pleading. "You must be mistaken." But Mark shook his head. "I'm not." His eyes stayed on me, steady now, filled with a kind of recognition that burned hotter than the lights strung above us. The room buzzed with disbelief. "No way, that can't be her. But she's been—" The whispers tangled together, thick with shock. I didn't move. I didn't try to explain. I let their voices fill the space, let their confusion grow. The truth didn't need my defense. It was already in the room, flashing across the screen of every phone being passed from hand to hand. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched her champagne flute too tightly. "This is my wedding," she snapped, her voice cracking. "Not some Hollywood stunt." But no one was laughing with her now. The spotlight had shifted the air thick with the weight of a story rewritten in real time. For the first time all night, their eyes weren't sliding past me. They were fixed wide and searching, as though they were seeing me for the very first time. And I sat there, calm, steady, the storm swirling around me, knowing the balance of the evening had just changed. Margaret's chair screeched against the floor as she pushed back and stood. Her napkin slipped from her lap, crumpled in her trembling hands. "We're proud of you, Madison," she said, her voice breaking, as though tears alone might soften the years of silence. "We've always been proud." The words hung in the air, fragile, almost believable, if they hadn't come now in front of 100 watching eyes. I met her gaze steady. "Would you still be proud," I asked quietly, "if all I had was $50,000 and not a $200 million deal? Would you still stand there and say those words?" Her mouth opened, then shut. The room exhaled with her, uneasy. Charles slammed his palm flat on the table, the silverware rattling. His face was flushed red, his jaw tight. "Enough! You're ruining your sister's wedding. This night is not about you." I turned toward him, my voice calm but sharp. "It was never about me, was it? Not once. Every toast, every story, every proud word, always about Emily." Gasps echoed from the tables nearby, the discomfort spreading like wildfire. Emily shoved her chair back with a screech, the lace of her gown trembling as she rose. "You've always wanted this," she hissed, eyes flashing. "You can't stand that for once the spotlight is mine." I leaned back slightly, my tone even. "No, Emily. You made me the shadow. You needed me small so you could shine brighter. But tonight the light isn't yours to claim." For a moment, silence swallowed us both. Then Emily grabbed the microphone from the DJ's stand, the metal shrieking with feedback. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her lipstick smeared from the trembling of her lips. She spun toward the crowd, voice cracking but loud enough to rattle the chandeliers. "She's destroying my wedding," she screamed, jabbing a finger in my direction. "She's ruining everything. She's always wanted to take from me, and now she's here to humiliate me in front of all of you." Her voice spiraled into hysteria, words tripping over each other. "She's jealous. She's pathetic. She's stealing the only day that's supposed to be mine." The hall froze. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier laughter curdled into unease. Eleanor clutched her pearls, whispering something to Edward. The bridesmaids looked down at their hands, avoiding Emily's wild eyes. And then, with her chest heaving, Emily shrieked into the microphone, "You ruined my wedding, Madison. You've destroyed it." The feedback screeched again and the room recoiled. Her makeup streaked, her gown wrinkled where she clutched it in her fists, her perfect image unraveling under the weight of her own fury. I sat motionless at my table, my expression calm as the chaos erupted on the stage. The spotlight she'd fought so hard to protect had finally turned cruel, exposing her, not me. The hall was utterly still, the only sound Emily's ragged sobs amplified by the mic. And in that silence, every guest knew the meltdown belonged to her, not me. The hall had fallen into a strange hush, a vacuum where laughter had lived only minutes before. Whispers replaced it, sharp, hurried weaving through the tables like drafts of cold air. Guests leaned toward each other, eyes darting between Emily's crumpled figure on stage and me still seated at the far end. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Josh phone, angled low screen glowing as comments scrolled faster than his thumb could follow. His mouth fell open, a grin tugging at the corner of his lips. He wasn't just recording anymore. He was streaming. I didn't need to see the words to know. I felt the energy shift, the way heads turned toward their own screens, notifications buzzing in pockets and handbags. Someone muttered, "It's already on TikTok." Another whispered, "Hashtags trending. Dog walker, producer." I rose slowly from my chair, the scrape of wood against tile louder than the collective breath of the room. All eyes snapped toward me, waiting for an explosion, for tears, for anything they could clutch as proof that I had broken. Instead, I straightened my shoulders and let my voice settle low and calm. Silence has always been my weapon. I thought words echoing in the back of my mind like a steady drumbeat. I set my glass on the table, the soft click carrying in the silence. My lips parted. And for once, I didn't whisper. I spoke clear enough for every corner of the tent to hear. "I am not the dog walker of this family," I said evenly. "I am me." The words landed heavier than I expected, slicing through the murmur, pinning the room still. Emily sobbed louder, clutching Mark's arm, begging him with her eyes to speak. But he didn't. His jaw was tight, his expression conflicted, and yet his silence was the loudest thing in the room. He didn't defend her. He didn't contradict me. He simply looked away, shame bleeding into his features. Margaret buried her face in a napkin. Charles muttered something under his breath, but no one rose to stop me. No one called my name. I let the silence stretch. Let it press against their skin the way it had pressed against mine for years. Then I turned, my heels clicking against the floor, each step echoing like a verdict. The air seemed to hold its breath as I walked past the rows of stunned faces, past the chandeliers still swaying from Emily's outburst, past the life they had written for me. The tent's opening revealed the vineyard beyond rows of vines bathed in soft golden light strung overhead. I stepped into the night air, cool and sharp, the murmur of chaos fading behind me. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I moved further down the path. The hum of voices grew distant, swallowed by the quiet of the valley. Above me the stars stretched wide and indifferent, and for the first time that night I felt the weight in my chest loosen. I didn't look back. Not once. The hall behind me was collapsing into its own storm, but I left it there. My sister's shrill cries, my parents' silence, the guests' frantic whispers. All of it dissolving as I walked deeper into the glow of the vineyard lights. The farther I went, the lighter I felt until only the echo of my own footsteps kept me company. And in that solitude, surrounded by vines heavy with fruit and air sweet with earth, I finally breathed. The freeway stretched ahead in ribbons of black asphalt and silver light, the vineyards shrinking behind me as I drove south. The dashboard clock ticked past midnight. The silence in the car was thick, broken only by the hum of tires on pavement and the faint static of the radio. Then the announcer's voice cut in, calm and professional, but sharp enough to make my pulse quicken. Breaking news footage from a wedding in Napa Valley has gone viral tonight, showing Hollywood producer Madison Clark being mocked by her own family. The clip, labeled with the hashtag #DogWalkerProducer, has already gained millions of views in just a few hours. More after this? My hands tightened on the wheel, not from fear, but from something colder, steadier. I exhaled, a laugh curling at the edge of my lips. I didn't need to destroy them, I whispered to the empty car. They did it themselves. The headlights carved a path through the dark as Los Angeles drew closer, the skyline waiting like an old secret I had finally come home to. By morning, the video was everywhere. Screens lit up in coffee shops, on sidewalks, in the lobby of my building. People whispered, stared, and then looked again, realizing the woman they had dismissed in a caption was the same face from Variety's cover. I walked past them without slowing, my heels striking the marble floors with a rhythm that belonged to me alone. Inside Paramount's offices, the air smelled faintly of ink and leather contracts piled high on polished desks. I sat at the head of the conference table, the $200 million deal spread open before me, my signature anchoring the bottom line. Executives murmured numbers, dates, projections, but my eyes caught only the weight of the paper beneath my fingertips. I thought back to the nights of walking dogs through rain-slicked alleys, to the lawsuit that had branded me a failure, to the whispers that followed me through every family gathering. I remembered Emily's smirk as she raised her glass, calling me the family dog walker, and the laughter that swallowed me whole. I looked up at the logo on the screen behind the table. Paramount, and the irony almost made me smile. The same voice that had been silenced for years now carried the kind of weight that filled boardrooms. When the meeting ended, I lingered alone for a moment. The city stretched beyond the windows, cranes cutting into the horizon, neon bleeding into the haze. I pressed my palm to the glass, feeling the vibration of life pulsing below. The voice in my head was steady, softer than it had ever been. I remember the days when they called me nothing more than a dog walker. I remember how small they needed me to be. But success isn't revenge. It isn't about proving them wrong. Success is freedom. Freedom to walk out of their house and never look back. Freedom to decide my own worth without waiting for theirs. Freedom to take every scar, every insult, every quiet humiliation and let it fuel something bigger than their laughter could ever contain. And now, standing here, I know I am not their shadow. I never was. If you've ever been told you're not enough, if you've ever been laughed at, dismissed, or shoved aside, don't let their voices define you. Your value doesn't come from their approval. It comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when no one else sees it. Because in the end, success isn't about revenge. It's about living so fully, so freely, that their approval becomes irrelevant. That's not revenge, that's freedom. So tell me, have you ever had a moment where someone underestimated you and you proved them wrong just by being who you are? Share it. Stay with us. There are more stories like this waiting for you, my